Yeah, I want to go into a little bit about rust repair on vehicles. This is basically going to be more like of an informational video because I'm not going to start doing anything on this for a while yet. But one thing is you want to measure the thickness of the actual metal you're using on a vehicle. Typically, you know, I've seen on the internet where they said 20 gauge. That stuff is too thin for most vehicles on most parts of the vehicle. Even you're talking like the standard sheet metal for the body rust. Now this Suzuki Jeep, this is a Samurai or an SJ210. The metal on this is pretty thin stuff. It's actually 18 gauge, but I think a lot of cars are more closer to 16 gauge, not 18 gauge. But I'm going to use 18 gauge on this for a couple tiny rust spots. There's a couple little ones on here on the fenders. But if you notice on this Samurai, there's no rust on the doors, nothing on the rocker panels, nothing up around the wheel well. And I'm going to state why that is, because I had this from basically about 2 years old, and there's nothing even up and around in here, on the, just only here on the fenders and the floor, because something, it got flooded out in there, it was left with rain. But this is about 18 gauge. Most cars, if you're doing like one of the older 60s cars or 50 cars, I'm going to say 16 gauge for most of this, not the floors, but you know, I'm talking like if you're fixing any kind of rust on the fenders or anything like that. And you want to check it with a vernier caliber. So, you know, here you got 10 gauge, you know, 134 thousandths, 12 gauge, 104 thousandths, 14 gauge, 75 thousandths, 16 gauge, 60 thousandths, 18 gauge, 49 thousandths, 20 gauge, 36 thousandths. Okay, now that's a common question as what thickness sheet metal to use. Very common question. But I measured this on this Jeep Samurai. It is about 18 gauge, and this stuff is pretty thin. It's not thick. Now the floor pan itself, I'm probably going to get some 10 gauge because it's about, you can see, well, there's a body plug there and there's some holes. I'm actually going to probably fix this with not a large patch but a few patches. And what happened was there was water that got under here, and if it sits, that's what happens, you know. I'm probably going to do 1, 2, 3, 4 patches because the rest of the metal is actually pretty damn solid. I'll just cut them out in squares, do a slight overlap, and I'm going to use the MIG welder as a flux core welder. But again, I want to point out no other rust on this. And you know, when you're using you know, except for minor things, the 2 fenders and on the bottom, that's it. And this is because this was sprayed with WD-40 waxes, just the wax you use on a car, the spray wax. It was just all poured into there. It was always maintained like that, and it just didn't rust. And I'm fixing this because it's got a rebuilt engine, not a rebuilt engine, a rebuilt transfer case, rebuilt transmission, lifetime warranty. The engine has over 200,000 miles, doesn't burn a drop of oil. So, with the body, the paint on it's like really, you know. I'm going to get into that about the paint real quick too, because these are common questions. A lot of people want to know how to do this cheap. Now I'm going to use the MIG welder as a flux, you know, I'm not going to MIG weld that floor. I'm going to use it as the flux wire feed welder, and I'm going to get better wire than that, what do you call it, the Harbor Freight wire, because it's junk, and get a good quality flux wire. It's not going to have a problem on the floor, you know, if it's a little sloppy, because it's a floor, there's a floor mat underneath it, and it's a Jeep, right? It's not like a freaking restoration vehicle or something. And the other thing I'm going to use is copper weld-through primer versus zinc. You know, a lot of people look at the weld-through primer and they see zinc weld-through primer for doing body panels, like I'll be doing these down here. I'm going to use copper. Copper is made for like the MIG welding. Now I'm going to be flux welding it, not exactly MIG welding. I'm going to take the actual fenders off of this and do it you know, when I'm off the car and do it that way. But it should work out pretty good with some good flux wire for this, for the Jeep, you know. Now, I'm going to point out something else. A lot of people I've seen on YouTube and on the internet use Rustoleum to paint the car with and all this kind of garbage. Now, I've actually been around the auto body industry kind of unprofessionally for a while, many years ago. We used to paint, not me, I did like not the final stuff, but it used to be a lot of cars were actually done outside, not even in a paint booth, and they went into shows. Corvette, Concourse, car shows, best stuff around. Black, it was back when acrylic lacquer was the norm, and the clear coat would have a little black in it to give it that deeper luster where it didn't look like it's a clear coat. That was another trick. But just to give you a little history, I had the 69 Roadrunner convertible. We did that car outside in the blue. It was when Ditzler Delstar came out with the urethane with the catalyst. It was like in the 70s when they first came out with that stuff. The standard fine paint jobs were acrylic lacquer. Now, I'm going to go over what a lot of people do that's better than Rustoleum they can get. I'm not going to recommend this, but I'm going to tell you what the price is and everything. This is actually a good oil-based enamel. It's the alkyd enamel. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's tractor paint. It actually is better than Rustoleum. It'll hold up, especially if you use the catalyst hardener, and you got to use reducer if you're using a spray gun. It actually will hold up a while, and you should prime the car. But that's like $54 when you add this up, right? Very cheap for a gallon. Pretty much you can get, usually a small car, a gallon's no problem. Bigger car might be 5 quarts, 6 quarts. Depends on the color, depends on the coverage, depends on what color primer you use underneath it too. You know, if you're using a light gray primer and you're using like you know, a car color that's close to the light gray, it'll cover nice. You know, if you're using like a reddish primer, you know, that makes a difference too. It depends on the type of color it is. It's not bad paint. This is Town & Country Enamel Magic Paint. It's pretty good, tractor paint. You'd want to use the catalytic hardener and you want to use the reducer. Now, paint for cars, and this is what I'm going to be painting this with. I'm just going to get a kit for 68 bucks. It includes the hardener and reducer. You get a couple masks. You just paint this outside. You're not going to die from, you know, like urethane. That stuff, man, you need the equipment for it, right? Filters, masks, stirring sticks. But it has the hardener and reducer in it, 68 bucks for black. That would easily cover this, but then you'd have to get the primer and, you know, all that stuff. So, you know, this actually is one of your best deals. It's actually, I don't know why anybody paints with Rustoleum, unless they're using the Rustoleum automotive paints, which are not that cheap actually. They're pretty cheap, but they're not that cheap. But you know, people will knock this type acrylic enamel, but back in the day, I think in the 60s, that's what Chrysler used, acrylic enamel that was baked on. So when you're using this acrylic enamel with the hardener, it's as good as a car that was back in the 60s. And there's cars around today that still have the same paint from 50 years ago. So I mean, it's not really shit. It's not really garbage. Urethane is a lot better with the catalyst and using the clear coat, top coat. This is a one stage, but there's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with this. But if you start going to urethane with the catalyst and 2-stage, hell of a lot more work, hell of a lot more money. This actually is a good deal for a hobbyist. I would recommend getting this over going with the tractor paint, and I would definitely recommend getting the tractor paint over just going in a hardware store and getting yourself a gallon of Rustoleum. I've seen so many people on the net do that. I don't know why the hell they're doing that, because like you're talking, even a cost between Rustoleum and the tractor paint, you're talking like maybe 15 bucks. And that's with the catalyst. That's way better for the whole paint job. And then, you know, another, I don't know, $13. And then you're considering you're getting this little, you know, a couple, you know, you in other words, you filter the paint when you put it in there. After you mix it, you filter it through. So you're getting filters, a couple little cheap masks. If you're doing it outside, those masks will be good enough. And I could, you know, I could actually paint here pretty good, even without, because I have like a roof thing I could put over here. But I could paint in here pretty good because it's shielded from wind. So, you know, I can actually get a halfway decent outside paint job in this area too, pretty good if I wanted to. So I just want to put this out of here for informational purposes. One, if you got like a compact car, and this Jeep is pretty much considered like the thinner sheet metal for compact cars, 18 gauge. You know, I see on the net they talk about 20 gauge for repairing rust, 18 gauge. If you got like an older Chevelle or any of like the American cars that are a little bit thicker metal, 16 gauge. And it looks for the floor pan on this Jeep, 12 gauge. So this will suffice for doing the couple little minor spots on the fenders, and I'm just going to go from there. But like in the other number two thing I said, another thing I said was with the spray through weldable primer, do not use the zinc. That's for spot welding. Use the copper base. And actually on this thing, when I do this, it's going to have the spray through weldable primer, but I'm going to take this off, and there's probably going to be some other coverings over that, like truck bed lining or something like that, so it'll never rust out again. But just another thing I said, because you see there's really no rust across the fenders here. There's no rust on the doors. There's no rust on the rocker panels going up the quarter panels. Usually you see these all rusted out bad. That's because I used to spray WD-40 and sprayable wax. No specialty rust products. It was strictly stuff right off the shelf. Spray wax for your car, WD-40. Just poured it in there and kept the drain holes clean. This thing has very little rust on it, and it's a 1985. So go figure that. Go figure that. And it's been outside, not garage kept.